freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. We're in FIRE's Philadelphia headquarters, and sitting to my left, who I will do my best to give all due respect, is my boss, Robert Shibley. He's the executive director here at FIRE. Across from him is Samantha Harris, who is the vice president of procedural advocacy here at FIRE. And then we also, of course, have Will Creeley, who's senior vice president of legal and public advocacy. All right, should we just jump right in? Last week, Babson College decided it was going to fire a professor after conducting a very lengthy one-day investigation into a Facebook post that he just shared with his friends after the whole Iran controversy came up. Backstory, President Trump tweeted out that Iran better be careful, essentially, and that we had them in our crosshairs, including their cultural targets, which resulted in a backlash from the chattering classes, of course, but also sparked some satire. And a lecturer over at Babson College, Asheen Fonzie, tweeted out, he didn't even tweet out. Well, this was a Facebook post, right, Will?
Yeah, it's a Facebook post, and it's a Facebook post.
Yeah, it's a Facebook post, and he said, in retaliation, Ayatollah Khomeini should tweet a list of 52 sites of beloved American cultural heritage that he would bomb. Mall of America, ? Kardashian residence, ? I don't know, I read that as satire, of course, commentary on America's consumerist celebrity culture. Some people took offense, resulted in a news site of some sort, a hybrid blog, news website, and tabloid that called attention to his Facebook post. I should note that his Facebook post was just sent to his friends. It wasn't a public one. But the typical backlash that we see happen when faculty often engage in extramural speech. There was one tweet that said, "Why does Babson College have an American-hating terrorist supporter on their payroll? Ask them," and then, of course, Babson's phone number. Babson released a statement the following morning that said that Babson College condemns any type of threatening words and or actions condoning violence and or hate. And then they continue to say, "We have immediately suspended him with pay pending the completion of our investigation." And I believe it was the next day he was fired.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen this before. I remember when I first started at FIRE, it was, Professor Guth?
Yep.
That was Kansas?
Yep.
Tweeting about the NRA.
Yep.
Finding himself in trouble. What did you think, Will, when you first heard about this?
Well, a couple things. Back to your original characterization, just for the record, I recall it wasn't just the quote-unquote chattering class that voiced concern about President's threat to the 52 Iranian cultural sites. There was also, if I'm not mistaken, Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, I shouldn't say chat. When I meant chattering class, talking heads on TV.
Right. I want to just put that it was also a question of whether or not it would constitute a war crime. So, matter of public concern, no question about it. You got the president saying something. Anything the president says is a matter of public concern, and that's beyond just this president. That's all presidents. Second of all, anything the Secretary of Defense says that might be at crosshairs or cross purposes with the president or contradict the president or even confirm the president is also equally a matter of public concern. I mean, the fact is, this is what everybody in the country was talking about and thinking about. And when everybody in the country is talking and thinking about something, that means other people will be making jokes about it. And that's, part of the great thing about living in this country. No matter how serious it is, you can have somebody making a joke. In fact, the more serious, sometimes the more funny.
Wait, so you're saying you don't think that the Kardashian residence is a beloved American cultural heritage site? I am offended by that.
I don't. Listen, I actually kind of like the idea. If you were the old, joke in philosophy or sociology, if you were 3,000 years in the future and you're telling your contemporary peers about what defined American society, I think you could do worse than the Mall of America and the Kardashian residence. Certainly, you're going to have hours of footage of the latter. So, he tells a joke. If somebody tells this joke on late night comedy, maybe it lands, maybe it doesn't, but it's an obvious joke. He tees it up, he lets it go, and it cost him his job. I mean, I feel terribly for Professor Fancy because I think that you have to engage in pretty willful misreading to consider this as some kind of real threat. If I'm not mistaken, I think Babson reported to the FBI and
yeah, they said we are
police.
cooperating with local, state, and federal authorities. They don't describe it as threatening words. They just say we condemn any type of threatening words. I'm assuming that's
If
Well, it has to be either threatening words and or actions condoning violence and or hate. I mean,
Right.
that's, you know.
If you're the FBI and you get this phone call, what kind of day are you having? Like, oh, professor, posted Kardashian residence, we'll be right on it. Scramble the fleet, let's go. You know, I mean, this one it depresses me because at the end of the day, professor is fired. Bad faith, willful misreading, and selective offense wins the day. Babson covers itself in dishonor. All of us are dumber as a result of this. I feel terribly for Professor Fancy, and I feel very badly about what it says about the political climate in our country and the climate for freedom of speech. It's depressing and embarrassing, and Babson should be ashamed of itself.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one thing that is a common thread running through a lot of these cases. I know, we're going to be talking later on about another case at UConn, some students suing university. One thing that is a common thread is that you often have people making private jokes. I mean, we had a case at Syracuse that involved video from a satirical fraternity roast that someone else disseminated. And only when someone who disagrees with the message chooses to disseminate it beyond the private audience for which it was initially intended, does it ultimately result in consequences for the person. So we see increasingly, in addition to cases where somebody truly does speak out publicly, which is still their right to do, instances where somebody's trying to tell a joke to their friends or among their friends, and one person decides to publicize that with the intention of getting that person in trouble, and it works.
Yeah. I think another thing that we see so often is the disingenuous statement that they're going to be conducting some kind of investigation about this. I have real trouble trying to figure out particularly what you would investigate in this statement. He says Ayatollah Khomeini should. He doesn't say, I'm going to help the Ayatollah. He doesn't say, I've got a line with the Ayatollah. He says, Ayatollah Khomeini should tweet a list of 52 sites. So what precisely, I would love to hear the mechanism by which that investigation took place. What are they investigating? This is one of the, very early on in FIRE's existence, we had the president.
I know where you're going. I like
that. That's what I was about to say, too.
President of the University of Alaska saying, Mark Hamilton?
Yeah, he was on this
saying
podcast.
That there's nothing to investigate when,
the professor was investigated for a poem she wrote
it was for
about child abuse in Native Alaskan communities something like that. And he said, when we're talking about a speech, there's nothing to investigate.
Yeah, what does the investigation look like as a practical matter? You press print, you print out the Facebook post, you look at it real close.
And you're like,
looks offensive to me.
Looks like he's made suggestions here, boys.
I think the investigation is probably...
Book 'em, Dano.
Yeah, exactly. And the sad thing about it is the investigation is probably, instead of looking at the speech itself, is looking at the reaction to the speech.
Exactly.
Right.
That's the real investigation.
The investigation is what can we get away with?
Right. How many likes do the critics have? How many retweets does Turtle Boy News have? That's the real question.
Right, and I think sadly, oftentimes, and it's part of the reason for FIRE's existence, the calculus in a lot of these administrators' minds is, okay, who's going to give us more trouble? The professor who we fire for saying something protected, or all the mob that's unappeased if we stand up for free speech. And I think too often universities decide it's better to appease the mob, that their chances of staying out of the spotlight are better if they appease the mob.
Yep.
And one of FIRE's sort of raison d'etre is that we want to change that calculus, but unfortunately some administrators still...
A sad commentary is that the fact that they said they were investigating means they're not actually the worst. I mean, sometimes they don't even pretend to do an investigation. They just can you for what you said.
Right, at least they pretended. Right?
Yeah, right.
I will say, to Sam's excellent point about changing the calculus, if you're listening to this, and if you think that people in the United States of America should be able to make jokes without it costing them their job on their private Facebook page, take a second, go over to, babson.edu, find the president's address, find some decision maker's address, and write him a letter.
Yeah.
And you can tell him that Will Creeley of FIRE said, what's going on at your school? I just thought I would ask, do you promise free speech or do you not? Do you promise free speech until it offends people who are loud on the internet? Because if that's the promise, you don't promise free speech. You should be honest about it.
And one thing I want to tack on here is, what they say here is we've immediately suspended him with pay pending the completion of our investigation. So one possible outcome here, it's one we've seen before, is that the university, if they're getting enough pressure from groups like FIRE and other free speech supporters, is they're going to say, well, we completed our investigation and there's nothing to see here, and wouldn't you look at that, the process works.
I'm pretty sure they
right?
fired him.
And that's,
No, they did.
They did fire
Oh,
him.
okay.
Yeah, he's fired.
But, even in cases where they have the investigation and they say, look, the process worked, we exonerated him after an investigation, and we've seen that in a lot of cases.
Yep.
The investigation itself, the punishment is the process, and being dragged through an investigation is going to chill other people from speaking out. So even if they had not fired him, just the fact of the investigation itself alone was a violation of his rights.
Yep.
And that's why we need more President Mark Hamilton to send a one-page letter to all their departments, I think is what he did, or all the campuses, because he was the president of the University of Alaska system, and said, when protected speech is at issue, there is nothing to investigate. And an interesting historical note here was that back in 2016, when President Trump had just been elected, on that night, I believe, there was a group of conservative students from Babson who drove through neighboring Wellesley College.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Hillary Clinton's alma mater, am I remember that correctly? Right.
Yes, and were cheering, being rambunctious, celebrating. And the university, if I'm not mistaken, investigated their speech.
They did,
as well.
and we wrote about it.
And we wrote about it, and they ended up backing down. But in this case, unfortunately, they didn't back down. And unfortunately, in this case, Mr. Fanzi isn't a tenured professor, which would trigger some procedural protections. He was fired the next day.
Those students were eventually found not responsible on December 19th, 2016, but it took a letter from FIRE and pressure to change that calculus. And again, I just want to remind folks, if you're feeling aggrieved, it's Office of the President, all one word, at Babson, babson.edu.
There you go.
Write a letter now, tell them that FIRE sent you, and ask them to account for the glaring discrepancy between their promises and their practices, because I don't think they're going to give you a good answer. And Professor Fanzi will be the first one to tell you that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's definitely fair play if people are writing and calling in to fire this professor. For others, of course, who support this professor's right to free speech,
That's
to
right.
write in and say that the university should have their back.
You got it.
All right, let's move on to the other item that's in the news. This is at the University of Connecticut, and this has captured headlines both in the Northeast, but also across the country. It involved two University of Connecticut students who were arrested, what was that, a couple months ago? It might have been November, for using racial slurs in the process of playing the penis game, which is a game essentially where you keep yelling penis.
You say it louder
It's
and
like
louder.
a game of chicken. Like it involves one or more people, sort of, and it starts at a very low volume and it gradually escalates until somebody finally balks at saying it as loud as they would have to say it, in which case they lose.
Yeah, but they diverted away from just using the word penis to also using racial epithet, and this was caught on camera. This was late night. It was caught on camera, and the video eventually made its way into the hands of the university administration, which then looped in the police department. And the police department eventually charged these two students with violating a law that bans ridicule in advertising. This is what the statute reads that they were charged with. Bans ridicule on account of creed, religion, color, denomination, nationality, or race. Any person who, by his advertisement, ridicules or holds up to contempt any person or class of persons on account of the creed, religion, color, denomination, nationality, or race of such person or class of persons shall be guilty of a Class D misdemeanor. This is, I guess, a 1917 statute.
I really wish the lawsuit was challenging the constitutionality of this statute, too.
To be clear, Nico, that first sentence you read, I think, is just the title of the section. I think that's describing what it is. So the operative part is any person by his advertisement, et cetera, et cetera.
Ridicules or holds up to contempt.
Exactly.
I mean, this is a classic speech code, Sam.
Right.
You spend a lot of time reviewing speech codes on campus. This is one that's Connecticut law.
Well, I should note that this Class D misdemeanor did actually warrant an actual, apparently, investigation that took 11 days and involved driver's licenses, university surveillance cameras, Wi-Fi data, and card swipe data. So, I mean, this was dragnet. This was, you're looking for the one-armed man.
So this isn't just free speech. This is like the surveillance state, essentially bringing all of its resources to bear to find people who engaged in some, offensive.
And I would know, why do you think it was so hard to find those people? It's because when they were playing this wasn't actually, this epithet, the N-word, wasn't actually aimed at anybody. It was part of this game that they were playing. So it would have been easy to identify them if they had been in some sort of argument or actually calling somebody else that, but that wasn't the story. There was nobody that they were aiming this at.
This is
so
just shouting words into the air as loud as you can.
To be clear, this wasn't an attempt to, attack another person by using this word.
Right, and it's interesting because a lot of the news reporting has sort of downplayed that fact.
Right.
And you just keep reading sort of
so
students accused of shouting racial slurs.
This was,
but then when you read that they were playing the penis game, I mean, that just sort of really underscores sort of the fact that this was not targeted.
This wasn't an altercation of some
right.
kind.
Which is a crucial detail, right? Because if you think about the standard for discriminatory harassment in Title VI cases, right, you're talking about conduct that's so severe, pervasive, objectively offensive that it denies a student target access to an educational opportunity or benefit. So it is plausible to imagine if two students are running after a student yelling racial slurs at that student and chasing him out of, say, a cafeteria or a dorm room. Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're talking about something that's actually...
We're getting there.
Right,
Right.
You're getting
even under the, I would like to point out, mostly dead fighting words doctrine, where this probably would be the one word that might still qualify, would have to be aimed at somebody.
Right.
There's nobody there.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know, this one is going to be very interesting to watch. There's not beyond just the 1917 point, there's also the interesting note, and I shudder to think that anything from 1990 is now historical, but it is historical.
That was the year I was born.
Right, well, there you go. I'm old enough to remember 1990.
Me too.
Cue the black and white footage here of me wearing short pants and playing stickball.
Wonder Years song.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Peak of my awkward adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
Was it short pants? That was like the grunge era when you wanted to wear baggy pants.
I'm talking about my suspenders.
A little later. That was more like 92, 94.
Steak cost a nickel, and for 10 cents you could fly on a hot air balloon. I don't know. It's old timey. Anyway, so back in 1990, a federal district court entertained a lawsuit filed by Nino Wu, junior at the University of Connecticut, who had put up a handmade poster on a dorm room door.
Still dangerous today.
Right, and it listed the types of people who were welcome, tolerated, unwelcome, and shot on site. The last category included, quote, bimbos, quote, preppies, quote, racists, and some students say, quote, homos. And she was expelled from all residential and dining halls because they found the words on there to be violative of the university's anti-harassment rule.
By the way, one amusing fact about this is that while the investigation and the disciplinary action were taken on the basis of the anti-gay slur, the complaint was apparently actually brought by two women who felt that the word bimbos was directed at them.
That's right. So she was expelled from housing and dining halls and filed a federal lawsuit. And to resolve the lawsuit, University of Connecticut entered into a consent decree, a permanent injunction banning it from enforcing, quote, any policy that interferes with the exercise of First Amendment rights by any student when the exercise of such rights is unaccompanied by violence or the imminent threat of violence. Now that describes to a T the conduct here, however offensive to many or most. And the ACLU of Connecticut, if I'm recalling correctly, was instrumental in securing that consent decree. So the lawyer filing suit here and representing the student has pointed this fact out, and it'll be very interesting to see, and we'll have more updates.
Has the ACLU of Connecticut weighed in on this latest case or not yet?
They did a while back, and then David Cole chimed in as well and said, this is, while perhaps offensive, this is protected speech, it's classic protected speech.
Yeah, so we shall see how this one goes with that echo from 30 years ago.
Yeah, and to be clear, this, if we didn't say it, this lawsuit is challenging the university's continued attempts to boot them out of the dorm. They're actually not challenging this statute, right?
This Class D misdemeanor statute, one of the students has accepted a diversionary plea agreement. The other student, I think, is still fighting it, but both of the students are suing for being found responsible for violating the school's disruptive behavior policy and the move by the university to remove them from all campus housing. So that's who the lawsuit is aimed at. It's aimed at the university. It's not aimed at the Connecticut statute, although I agree, it would be nice if that was challenged as well, and maybe the one
hard to see
student
that
who's still
holding up in
fighting.
court, at least as applied.
And to be clear, this I know I keep saying to be clear.
No, but let's be clear.
You know, you're right. The statute applies to advertising. I mean,
Well,
by
it's
his
hard to
advertisement. Well, I mean, I think
By
we
his, I don't know if
looked
that's
into
not
it.
weird 1917 speak, but
I don't believe it was. I believe it actually had to do. I believe we looked into this, and I'm sure people who listen to the podcast can write an angry letter if I'm wrong or they disagree. But we looked into it, and it actually did have to do with. It was basically trying to clamp down on advertisements that were insulting people.
Advertising.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think of Peter Tosh, legalize it, and I will advertise
related to
it.
Daniel?
Yeah. So the advertising, right? Are you advertising in commercial speech? Or are you advertising by virtue of endorsement?
Either way, though, I think it would be
one last point before we leave this one, Nico, if I may.
Yeah.
This past week, the digital rights organization Fight for the Future and our good friends over at Students for Sensible Drug Policy, see that? I did a Peter Tosh segue into SSDP. They launched a campaign raising alarm about the increased use of facial recognition software in campus security systems. And it's an interesting and worthy project. We may have more to say about that in the future. But folks are interested in the creeping surveillance state on campus and what that will do to American expectations of privacy. If you go to, in the same way that we're concerned, if you go to school in a place where you don't have full expressive rights, if you go to school in a place where you don't have privacy rights, and if you're constantly subjected to facial recognition software, what that does to normalize the use of that software in larger society, check out the SSDP and Fight for the Future campaign that just launched.
So a question, maybe this is best directed to you, Will, about this lawsuit. So can the university just claim that, well, first of all, this is the University Police Department that initiated the investigation based on the statute that's still technically a good law in the state of Connecticut and apparently has been used and abused by Connecticut police, and they can just say, well, it's our policy that if you violate the law on campus, then...
Because the lawsuit is pending, I'm going to reserve comment.
Gotcha. Well, we'll see where that goes. But yeah, that looks like a ridicule. How do you define ridicule?
Oh yeah.
Holding contempt of a person or class of persons seems like a classic speech code that we see on campuses all the time. Again, keeping things light. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about the use of racial epithets.
Get a cup of coffee.
Let's move now on to anti-Semitism. Last month, on December 11th, we received an executive order, or the nation received an executive order from the Trump administration called Combating Anti-Semitism, which sought to, the best way to describe it is to quote it, says, discrimination against Jews may give rise to a Title VI violation when the discrimination is based on an individual's race, color, or national origin. It shall be the policy of the executive branch to enforce Title VI against prohibited forms of discrimination rooted in anti-Semitism as vigorously as against all other forms of discrimination prohibited by Title VI. And one of the ways it tries to determine what is anti-Semitism is through the use of this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and the associated examples. Now, the definition of anti-Semitism is this. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And then it provides some examples of how anti-Semitism might manifest itself, including making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations against Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, applying doubled standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any democratic nation, it in that case, of course, State of Israel. Another one is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, this might, of course, loop in protected speech, regardless of what you think of the speech. Criticisms of Israel, Israel's right to exist, comparing what's going on between Israel and Palestine to something that's happening with the Nazis. Protected speech, perhaps, I want to loop the experts in now. The executive order itself says, in considering the materials described in the subsections of this section, agencies shall not diminish or infringe upon any right protected under federal law or under the First Amendment. Does that save them?
No, you can't just staple a copy of the First Amendment on a speech code and say, hey, but don't get us wrong, First Amendment, right? If it was that easy, we'd have a hell of a tough road here at Fire if all you had to do is put hashtag First Amendment on your unconstitutional policy. No, that doesn't get them out of the woods. We know from both hard-won experience here and from what courts have told us that savings clauses like that don't rescue statutes' constitutionality. There's a great opinion from Magistrate Judge Wayne Brazil in the College Republicans versus San Francisco State University case from some years ago, which is a great case. If you have 5 minutes and you're interested, check it out on our website. But in addition to making a lot of other excellent points, Magistrate Judge Brazil points out that students are not First Amendment scholars, and you cannot presume or posit a expansive knowledge of First Amendment precedent to students, those covered by the law, or those enforcing the terms of the executive order. So, in other words, you can say that this doesn't include First Amendment protected speech, but if everything preceding that savings clause contemplates protected speech, or significant portions of it do, the contradiction there in terms will be reasonably interpreted by those seeking to comply by it or enforce it to preclude that kind of speech in the first place. So the effect is the same.
Well, in that case is actually, interesting to bring up in connection with this issue, because it sort of illustrates how when we get into restricting protected speech or trying to judge whether something is permissible or not based on the viewpoint of the speaker, the case at San Francisco State, which was many years ago now, was I think 2006 or 2007, but that was, members of the college Republicans who were brought up on disciplinary charges after they held an anti-terrorism rally where they stomped on a paper replica they had made of the Hezbollah flag. And because the name Hezbollah in Arabic contains the name of God, the word God in Arabic, people found it insulting that they would step on this, and they were brought up on charges of incivility and things like that. And one of the points that we have been trying to make with regard to this executive order, because I think that listen, and I'm coming from a perspective. I'm Jewish. My children attend a Jewish school where there's an armed guard. We go to synagogue with an armed guard every week. I think that Jews are very concerned about anti-Semitism right now, and often feel like, at least on some campuses, their concerns are taken less seriously than perhaps, similar concerns expressed by other groups. And one thing we've really been trying to illustrate is that, the answer is not giving the government the power to determine what speech is and is not permissible. And, to sort of illustrate it, you just have to put the shoe on the other foot. If President Trump can issue an executive order that says it's anti-Semitic and possible evidence of harassment to, deny Israel's right to exist as a state, then a hypothetical, say, President Sanders could issue an executive order saying that it's evidence of Islamophobia to deny the right to Palestinian statehood.
That's right.
Right? So, I feel like there's a lot of sort of short-sightedness here, in an effort, I think, to address something that's really got people scared. But it's when people are scared that these things happen, that the government clamps down on protected speech. And so, the fact that there is this climate where, we've been seeing incidents of actual violence and threats against Jews, it means we need to be all the more vigilant not to compromise our fundamental rights as we try to address this.
Yeah, there was a real missed opportunity here too, which is that the first part of the executive order is actually something that neither Fire nor just about anybody else we can find out there really has an objection to, which was making it clear that for purposes of Title VI, that Jewishness, being Jewish, would be considered a subdivision of race, basically an ethnicity.
National origin or ethnic
discrimination.
Exactly,
because Title VI, for historical reasons, doesn't include religion. In fact, religion is only unlawful to discriminate against on the federal level in terms of educational admissions. It actually doesn't apply to the normal harassment, the laws, Title VI and Title IX.
Just for clarification, Title VI is violated when there's discrimination on the basis of race,
color,
or
and national origin, not religion, right? And then Title IX, it has to do with discrimination on the basis of sex.
And Title VI, to be clear, for all non-lawyers, those who don't work in this industry, applies to the institution itself. But it's also responsible for ensuring that its charges or its students, its faculty don't...
It's similar to Title IX, which is a prohibition on sex discrimination, in that it requires institutions that receive federal funds not to engage in discrimination on the basis of, with Title IX, it's sex, with Title VI, it's race, national origin. But peer harassment that creates a sufficiently hostile environment under either Title IX or Title VI can give rise to institutional liability if the institution allows it to go on and is what we call deliberately indifferent to it.
Knows about it.
Right.
And so the sort of historical, and this is more recent historical problem that it had originally grown up was that because Judaism is both a religion and an ethnicity, it was a little bit too easy, in many people's opinion, for the government to decide that it didn't need to consider it for Title VI purposes, because they could say, oh, well, you're being discriminated against because you're of Jewish religion and not ethnicity. However, there's been a bipartisan consensus since the second Bush administration. George W. Bush administration is when this began, and then it was, I think, issued, I think, in a 2010 letter by the Obama administration that the Department of Education would consider Judaism to be an ethnicity for purposes of fitting it into Title VI. So the executive order could have said, actually now it's it's not just the Department of Education and it's not just sort of a statement of what we're going to do, but this is now actually has the force more or less of law to say this is how the government is going to consider this and sort of make that more permanent. And that was actually what the first one or two paragraphs of the executive order did. Where it really ran aground was deciding to add on what we think was really very unnecessarily this definition of anti-Semitism, which as specific as it is, was most certainly going to be controversial, although it's hard to think of a definition a definition that wouldn't be very, very general, that wouldn't be controversial in some way and impinge on protected speech.
Right, I mean, I don't think that the Department of Education could try to define any of the isms without getting into protected speech.
No, I don't think they have before either.
No, they
right?
haven't,
Yeah.
and that's why. I mean, it's what they need to be looking at is what is the conduct, and is the conduct rising to the level of severe and pervasive and objectively offensive harassment, not what does the person engaged in the conduct think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah, one point I think it behooves us to make that we've talked about internally is that in 2013, under the Obama administration, FIRE raised the alarm about a vast, broad, unfettered definition of sexual harassment that the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education announced as a blueprint for campus enforcement of Title IX that really included a great deal of protected speech, almost a limitless amount of protected speech on its face, unwanted conduct, including verbal conduct,
of a sexual nature.
And FIRE raised the alarm then. And we did so in somewhat lonely circumstances. I have First Amendment advocates, civil liberties advocates got it, but because the push to address sexual misconduct on campus is popular, and I think obviously well-intentioned, just as this measure I think is
popular and well-intentioned.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was dropped the day after the Jersey City shooting.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's at those moments, as Sam alluded to before, when it's most important for civil liberties advocates to stand up and say, wait a second. Think about all of the speech that you are hereby declaring permissible for punishment. And the point we've made here is that it would behoove folks in university administrations to stand up and say, I get what you're trying to do, here's why you can't do it that way. I understand the problem you're addressing, I see it too, here's why throwing the First Amendment out when you're doing it is a bad idea. And consistency in that regard is something that FIRE absolutely prides itself on, and we are happy to stand with universities, both then, now, and in the future, that want to make that stand as well.
So this isn't the first time we've seen this definition come up. you all might know the background better than I would. We're talking about the IHRA definition here, but it's also the definition used by the State
Which
Department.
is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
I was actually going to bring that up.
Yeah.
So the State Department adopted an earlier version of this, basically by posting it on their website, that was, I think, by the European Working Group
right.
on anti-Semitism or on Holocaust denial or
It's
something like that.
European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so it has gone through several iterations. This is
just one of
the
the
most recent 2016 version, and it actually has more examples than the version that FIRE saw and others saw, and even that its advocates, I think, started to advocate for back when the first push to adopt it was on, which I think is itself very telling in that it's not like this is some timeless, inarguable definition of anti-Semitism. It's changed within the last few years.
Right.
Since 2005 when it was first drafted.
Since 2005, and maybe had more than one iteration. It was also designed in the European context for identifying anti-Semitism abroad. I think I know what you're going to say, but bring it up. Yeah, exactly.
The lead author of the definition, Kenneth Stern, has testified in Congress and written an eloquent op-ed for the New York Times explaining that the purpose of the definition was to identify a concept, not to determine which speech should be prescribed on college campuses. And he's been a vocal opponent of the push over the past 4 or 5 years to incorporate this definition into campus speech regulation. And so I think that is telling in and of itself.
Yeah, and we have a blog post about this in which we have a couple blog posts about the efforts to get this definition incorporated into law, including the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which seems to come up every Congress. Kenneth Stern wrote a very popular New York Times op-ed pushing back against it on the points that you were just making, Will.
And just this week, South Dakota's governor passed an executive order doing much the same as the president's executive order. It's passed into state law in both South Carolina and New York. It's been considered in a host of other states, including New Jersey, just across the river from Philadelphia, where we sit today. So this is an old effort. We've been writing about it and pointing out the First Amendment flaws since 2015. If folks want more on this, I urge you to check out eminent First Amendment scholar, Professor Eugene Volokh, writing in his blog, The Volokh Conspiracy, at Reason.com. He's got an in-depth look at the First Amendment problems here, and as Sam alluded to before, he explains how setting a precedent for including protected speech in these definitions would be a problem under possible future administrations. You can't censor your way to tolerance and understanding. I think that's the kind of bottom line.
No, and again, the evolving...
You can't?
You can't do it.
And it's the evolving definition is such a good example of that, because they didn't, they felt the need to add more. I mean, that need is always going to be felt. I mean, we've managed to get through, since the Civil Rights Movement, without definitions of racism or sexism. And I'd like to think that Americans are capable of defining those and identifying those, I should say, without having to, write it down in a way that's either going to be under-inclusive or over-inclusive.
And context and facts are determined here. There's one example from the news, and then I will let us leave this subject. I think it was at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
Just this month. So here we are, over the past, since December 11th, talking about anti-Semitism, the president's executive order, and suggesting, as FIRE has and will continue to do, that Title VI be amended to specifically include religion, the step Robert was talking about in the first half of the executive order. We'd like to see that done by statute.
That's right.
But there's a lawsuit against Kutztown filed by a Jewish student who says, who alleges that her roommate and her roommate's boyfriend subjected her to really ugly anti-Semitic harassment. They smashed things in her room. They called her names. They sent her awful anti-Semitic text messages, that kind of thing. And the facts are really pretty harrowing. And then they refused to serve her food at the cafeteria. And so I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this is anti-Semitism.
Right. Anti-Semitic harassment.
Anti-Semitic discriminatory harassment of the type that should be prohibited by federal anti-discrimination law, just in the same way that if you had done that on the basis of other protected class status, you would have crossed.
And you don't need to look into the perpetrator's views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to know that it's anti-Semitic.
That's right. Exactly. It is a real thing that happens.
Right.
We shouldn't we don't lose sight of that, but it's also not necessary to get into these heavily loaded definitions for that. And you do see that sometimes, and it's identifiable.
Yeah. That's it. So, okay.
So I want to move from Title VI now to Title IX. And we're expecting
All
new
the titles.
Yeah,
Actually,
all the
no,
titles.
because we're not talking about Title VII.
Yeah.
Title X, I think it's
Title X.
Yeah, Title X. We're expecting new regulations to come from the Department of Education in the coming weeks. We don't know exactly when.
Don't remind me. That makes me feel like I should check my email.
I know.
I'll be on Twitter right now.
I think someone would run into the room.
I think
if
so.
that were to
yes.
happen. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that you interrupt the recording. We don't have the red light outside that says "Don't bother us," but
Oh, man.
even if we did, I think that would justify it. In any case, Title IX. This is something that we've been talking about for many years. Often, people only think of it in the context of due process. And some of the ways in 2011, under the Obama administration, the Department of Title IX said you needed to eliminate, if a school held certain due process protections, some of these protections, in order to make the process more equitable to accusers in sexual misconduct cases.
Right. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, right?
Office for Civil Rights, yeah, the Department of Education. Anyway, we're seeing this new department work to bring in more due process protections. We're also seeing them, this is a free speech podcast, potentially they might include a definition of harassment that is more speech protective than what we saw in the past decade or so. And this is what's called the Davis Standard. Robert, you wrote blog posts on FIRE's website, I think in December, about why this Davis Standard is the right standard so that discriminatory harassment is not allowed on college campuses, and schools can get in trouble when it does occur with deliberate indifference, but also it protects speech. And this definition comes from a January 12th, 1999 Supreme Court decision written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, which said that school boards are liable when officials are deliberately indifferent to sexual harassment of which they have actual knowledge that harassment is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it can be said to deprive the victims of access to the educational opportunities or benefits provided by the school. Why aren't schools already abiding by the Supreme Court definition of harassment?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all is the fact that the Department of Education itself, since at least 2001 and maybe 1999, has been promulgating a definition of sexual harassment that reads differently, but which they said should be read to be in accord with the Davis Standard, where they use a severe or pervasive standard. They don't necessarily have the fact that the victim has to be effectively denied an education. And so that confusion is entered in. And then it would also be wrong to overlook the fact that this issue is very heavily political, and there's a lot of people who feel like the standard should be much lower. The beginning of sexual harassment, where it goes from annoying to actually being harassment, should be a much, much lower threshold. And so those two things together, I think many schools and the people who, administrators who work at those schools would like the definition to be much more inclusive of much, much more behavior that unfortunately many or even most people, depending on the policy, would not actually consider to be sexual harassment.
Well, and what we saw, going beyond that 2001 definition, what we saw, after 2011, which is when the Office for Civil Rights under the Obama administration really began to take a very active and aggressive role in, the way schools handle sexual misconduct claims on campus. In some resolution agreements with colleges and universities, they used an even more expansive definition, which was, quote, any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature.
This is a blueprint definition.
Yes.
Yeah, specifically including verbal conduct.
So
which
although
is speech.
they walked that back sort of privately in a letter to FIRE, the damage was done, and a lot of universities actually adopted and continue to this day to maintain that definition as the operative definition of sexual harassment in their policies.
Mm-hmm. And it's just for a second, what that means for folks is that if somebody else doesn't like something you say and it's arguably related to sex
or gender,
mm-hmm. That's it.
That's it. So you don't like gay marriage, you don't like women in the military, you disagree,
or you do like,
or you do like, and
Right,
somebody
right.
complains about it, guess what? You've got an investigation because you engaged in unwelcome verbal conduct of a sexual nature, which just means about sex or gender or whatever.
So Title IX, 1976, right?
1972.
1972.
Education Amendments of 1972.
But it's like a 26-word statute, right?
Quick editor's note here. Title IX is actually a 37-word statute, not a 26-word statute. I don't know where I got 26 from.
Well, the operative part is. The rest of it is mostly exceptions.
Right, I mean,
and
it's interesting,
few
a lot of-
instructions.
One of the first things a lot of people ask when they read the statute is, well, why does this require colleges and universities to address sexual harassment and sexual assault? And the answer to that is that through a series of court decisions and administrative regulations, the definition of discrimination has been expanded to include harassment that creates an environment so hostile that it has the effect, essentially, of amounting to discrimination, right? So, for example, in the earliest cases, it dealt with quid pro quo harassment. So if you are a female student at a university and you have a professor who is demanding sex in exchange for good grades, yes, that may not be the university itself discriminating against you, but if the university doesn't address it in some way, if you go to the university and they don't address it in some way,
or have a policy prohibiting it.
or have a policy prohibiting it, then you're effectively being discriminated against. I mean, if you can't get the grades you need to succeed because you're refusing to have sex with a professor and the university ignores your complaints about it,
We got a problem.
that has the effect of discrimination, and that has been expanded beyond quid pro quo to include student-on-student harassment. So if severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive student-on-student harassment is occurring on campus, the university is aware of it and acts in a way that's deliberately indifferent to it, that can be said to be the equivalent of discriminating, the university discriminating against you on the basis of sex. So that's how we got from, the 26-word sexual discrimination statute to all of these processes that universities have to adjudicate sexual harassment and sexual misconduct claims.
Right, and that does, if you draw the standard the right way, as you said earlier, Nico, right, you can have discriminatory harassment and schools should respond to discriminatory harassment properly defined, right? And you can have a standard that is carefully crafted to protect the First Amendment, dialogue, discussion, academic freedom interests that we hold dear, along with the good and necessary public policy of allowing students to receive an education without suffering from discriminatory harassment. You just got to draw the definition the right way. And it's got to be a necessarily clear and exacting bar. And that's what the court put forth in 1999 when they issued the Davis decision, which actually concerned a really ugly sexual misconduct at the grade school level. Mm-hmm. But is applicable to institutions, including institutions of higher education covered by Title IX. And in the Davis decision, as both Robert and Sam have written about eloquently, you see this really fascinating back and forth between Justice O'Connor, writing for the 5 justices in the majority, and Justice Kennedy in dissent, where Kennedy is worried that the Davis definition is too low. It'll restrict speech, that it is, in effect, a speech code. It's a de facto speech code and will allow simple disagreements to constitute claims of discriminatory harassment.
And he predicted a flood of litigation on both sides, and he was correct about that.
He was right about
sometimes
that.
you
It's
read
correct, except that they weren't actually using the Davis definition.
Right.
Now, he thought that would be too low, but it turned out that was, people didn't even adopt that. They didn't even end up
Right.
with the safeguard that the 5-justice majority, which was the 4 more on the left plus Sandra Day O'Connor, that they were saying, no, this isn't going to be a problem. But even there, the assumption was that there would be an application of this standard.
Right.
And
And so, as Robert said earlier, you get OCR, which declines right away to adopt the exact language. They thought their language was functionally consistent with Davis. And then 20 years later, here we are. So it'll be interesting to see, to circle back, be interesting to see if the new regs include Davis word for word, and as Fire has argued, that they should.
Yeah, I mean, the defenders of the status quo, which more or less comes down to defending what seems to have been and I know I'm speaking broadly, but what seems to have been that blueprint definition of any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, including verbal conduct, I think the people ought to understand that what they're defending is a prescription for abuses which don't even pass the laugh test and which make sexual harassment codes into itself a joke. The best example of this ever is the case we had at the University of Oregon, where a female student during exams saw a couple engaging in some kind of public display of affection out her window and yelled, "I hit it first," at the couple, implying that she had had sex with the guy in the couple first. The couple didn't think it was funny, and they, stormed in and found out who it was. And she was hit with 5 conduct charges for that 4-word joke, one of which was sexual harassment. But that "I hit it first" was unwelcome. Any unwelcome conduct,
including verbal conduct
of a sexual nature. It was. There's no denying it. That's the status quo right now at a huge number of schools, and the status quo that the opponents of the new regulations are trying to defend. It's indefensible.
The law
professor
How about
the law professor at Howard who had a hypothetical? For those of you who have not gone to law school, exams involve these wacky hypotheticals that, where you're supposed to basically apply the knowledge you've gained to really sort of unusual scenarios, and they're notorious for being just sort of crazy, have these
weird,
convoluted factual patterns. And so, this professor designed a hypothetical that involved, somebody who fell asleep while receiving a Brazilian wax and believed when she awoke that she'd been inappropriately touched, and what were the potential legal issues there. And the professor was subjected to some ridiculous length,
500 and something days.
Sexual harassment investigation because students objected to the fact that he mentioned a Brazilian wax in his hypothetical.
We got a million of them. There's the student newspaper at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that was investigated for almost a year for their April Fool's issue, where they had an article about, boy, there are an awful lot of phallic-shaped buildings going up around campus. How about some Ionic-shaped buildings, right?
Right, and they reprinted that picture from, what is it, Patch Adams?
From a PG-13 movie, but that subjected to an 11. Don't get me started. We could do a whole hour
That's
podcast
the
on
status
bad
quo.
examples.
If this isn't changed in these regulations, that is going to continue to be the status quo on campuses.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I talk so often, once people find out what I do, to people who have kids in school, or adult students in college, and they can't believe it. And at the same time, a lot of times, they are hearing from their students, "Oh, I don't feel like it's safe to say anything around here." And I have to be like, I got news, it's probably not. You should probably watch yourself because this is how low the bar is.
Yeah, and it leads to problems of selective enforcement. Like, if you
Because
read...
you obviously aren't enforcing it on everybody.
If you read
who
a
does
poem in your English class that offends one student, he or she has grounds for a claim, right? You read Allen Ginsberg's Howl, then you're off to the races if somebody in the class doesn't like it. Likewise, on the campus, if you listen to music out loud, pop music, and the lyrics in there that somebody doesn't like, et cetera, et cetera. The applications are limitless, and they're all bad. We hope for some clarity from the Department of Education. Maybe even when we end this podcast, we go back and check our email.
Yeah.
Don't know.
It really comes down to show me the man and I'll find you the crime situation. Laurenti Beria.
Show me the man or
head
woman,
of the KGB
right?
said that.
Or
Exactly.
we've seen, that's right. We've seen professors and students and all kinds of folks brought up on lousy sexual harassment charges, and it drives me nuts. And I won't even get into it, but Professor Teresa Buchanan, that's another bad example. I'm just getting worked up even thinking about
the
bad
list
examples.
goes on and on. And is it true that this is the first time that the Department of Education has actually gone through formal rulemaking on Title IX since it was first drafted?
No,
it's not.
No.
But it's in a while.
The previous stuff we're talking about, 2011, 2001, that was guidance.
2001 was guidance, but it
did go through notice and comment.
Weirdly put through notice, and actually it came out on the very last day of the Bill Clinton administration.
But rulemaking, it's the first time in a long time. I don't know the year offhand.
There was an op-ed today in Inside Higher Ed that I think, if I'm reading correctly, suggested that this was the first time it's gone through.
I got to go look it up now. If I'm wrong, folks, you can send your emails to will@thefire.org. I'll take emails too.
But it definitely is something that's unusual.
And it's a long process. This is a multi-year process.
And they've received over 100,000
130,000.
Yeah.
And you know what? Unlike the 2001 letter, people actually know what's going to, we gave notice. We got a chance to speak. That was something that Fire has been pushing for ever since the 2011 letter.
And fired a lawsuit to try.
Kudos to the department for actually going through what the law requires this time.
So the public should be allowed to comment.
So to put a bow on this, we talked about Title VI before, we talked about Title IX. In both cases, they prohibit discrimination of some sort. Title VI, race, color, national origin. Title IX, on the basis of sex. And through various mechanisms over the years, harassment is been determined to be a form of discrimination if the university doesn't properly address it. Right now, there's just larger debates happening about what actually constitutes harassment. Peer-on-peer harassment, hostile environment harassment. The courts have given us some clarity, as for example in Davis, but it's trying to get the agencies that actually enforce these in the schools to adopt those definitions and adopt definitions that don't prohibit protected speech. And that's something FIRE's been working on for many years, while also still recognizing that there are problems on campus that need to be discrimination needs to be addressed. It just needs to be done so without violating the First Amendment. So we'll stay tuned for that. Of course, check our website. We'll check our emails after this. See if something came down the pike. I'm going to leave it there because I got to head to a train now. Anything we missed? Any last words?
Well, it's January. We got a long year ahead of us. We got an election year, Nico.
And everybody's going to be super
stay tuned.
relaxed.
Super relaxed
already.
Right.
Who knows what surprises? Every morning, the first thing I do with one eye open is I hold my phone about 5 inches from my face. I read the Inside Higher Ed update. That's a plug for IHE. And I look at Twitter, and if nothing requires immediate attention, I consider that day off to a great start. You never know. We have our 9:15 a.m. meeting every day, and we get all kinds of interesting case submissions, so stay tuned. The year is young.
And also stay tuned for our 10 Worst Colleges for Free Speech list. That comes out typically in February.
We got a bunch of stinkers in that list. That is a bad
I'm actually
list.
looking at the list right now. I guess that schools have a couple of weeks to do the right thing and get off the list. But
no spoilers, but hey, you know who you are, bad schools. We've been warned. This is not a surprise to any of you.
Many ad nauseum in many cases.
All right. Well, this podcast is hosted and produced by me, Nico Perrino, and recorded and edited by Aaron Reese. You can learn more about So to Speak at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast. We take feedback, so to speak, at thefire.org.
Only good feedback? No.
Only good feedback. If you have good feedback, also consider leaving in a review
Fashion
at Apple
tips.
Podcasts, Google Play. We're on YouTube. That's a good hat tip to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thefire.org.
Ham radio?
Ham radio.
Ham radio?
Yeah, Robert was talking about that earlier.
Sorry, I'm derailing your outro.
Yeah, I've got this whole script written for my outro.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm
you're messing
your boss,
it all
so
up.
I can do it. All right.
Yes, you can do whatever you want. But until next time, I want to thank everyone again for listening or watching. Cheers.
Thank you.